David stared across the living room, utterly unprepared for what he'd just heard. The evening had begun so typically, with the two of them easing into the comfort of their shared space. After 8 years of marriage, there was a rhythm to their life together. He'd never questioned their bond, never doubted their connection. But tonight, Jane seemed distant, almost restless, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had barely settled onto the couch when she turned to him with a strange, almost casual expression and said, "I think I'd like to experience being with someone else. You know, just for excitement. I think it would actually be good for us." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. David blinked, convinced he'd misheard her. The idea was absurd, something he could scarcely imagine his wife saying. "What?" he managed to ask, his voice tinged with disbelief. But Jane didn't laugh or try to brush it off as a bad joke. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, a calm certainty in her gaze that only deepened his confusion. She began to explain herself, speaking as if this was something she had thought about for a long time and had finally decided to share with him. As she spoke, David's disbelief gave way to a deep, burning hurt. She went on about how their relationship had grown too predictable, too safe. She told him that she was craving something different, something that would make her feel alive. He sat there, listening to his wife, the woman he had dedicated 8 years of his life to, casually discussing her desire to seek intimacy elsewhere as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. She even suggested that her having an affair might bring a new spark to their marriage, a fresh perspective that she claimed would be good for them both. David's mind reeled, trying to process what was happening. A flood of questions and emotions surged within him. How long had she felt this way? Why hadn't she ever brought it up before? Did she truly believe that seeking another relationship would somehow benefit what they had built together? He looked at her, searching for a hint of guilt, of hesitation, anything to suggest she wasn't entirely serious. But her expression remained calm, detached, almost clinical. It was as if she had already convinced herself that this was an acceptable arrangement, that her desire for something new wouldn't cost them their life together. The hurt simmered into anger, but he swallowed it, unable to form words that could match the intensity of what he was feeling. "Jane," he started, but his voice trailed off, unsure how to respond to something so completely outside his expectations. The love he felt for her, a love he thought was solid and unwavering, now felt tainted, questioned by the very person he trusted most. Jane, seeing his reaction, tried to reassure him. She said she still loved him, that this was about her need for self-discovery, not a lack of love. She assured him that her feelings for him hadn't changed and that this would just be a temporary arrangement. But David wasn't comforted. Her words felt hollow, each one widening the gulf between them. He realized she truly believed her affair wouldn't affect their marriage, that he could somehow continue as her husband while she satisfied her curiosity elsewhere. By the end of the night, David was left with a sinking feeling, a growing sense of dread that things were far worse than he had imagined. For the first time, he felt utterly powerless in his own relationship, and the weight of that realization was suffocating. The days following Jane's confession were a blur of conflicting emotions. David had spent nights awake, his thoughts tumbling through the chaos she had introduced into his mind. Jane, on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the tension. She continued with her usual routine, casual and unaffected. At first, David thought perhaps she was just in denial, that the gravity of her actions hadn't truly sunk in. But the longer she went on without a change in behavior, the more it felt like she was moving forward with her plans without a second thought. She didn't see the damage she had caused, or if she did, she had chosen to ignore it. One night, as they sat at the kitchen table in silence, David's emotions spilled over, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Do you really think this won't change us? That you can have this affair, and I'll just go along with it?" His words were thick with hurt. "I would never mean to hurt you, David," Jane said quietly, setting her fork down. I don't know. I need something more. Her voice was softer now, tinged with uncertainty, but David wasn't sure if it was genuine regret or just the fear of facing the consequences. He wanted to believe it was the former, but his heart couldn't shake the feeling that her desire for something more had already taken root and was growing beyond their marriage. David sat there, feeling the weight of the moment. He could have lashed out, demanded she take it all back, demanded she choose between him and whatever fantasy she had in mind. But he didn't. Something deep within him told him that forcing her to choose wouldn't be enough. He had to let her see the consequences for herself. He needed her to understand just how badly she had damaged their trust. Maybe I just need time to think about this, David said, his voice trembling with vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to express before. I don't want to lose you, Jane. But I can't ignore what you've told me. I don't know how we can just go back to normal, after this. Jane nodded, almost too quickly, as though she had been waiting for this opening. Take all the time you need, she said softly. I don't want to lose you either. In the days that followed, David tried to process the mess she had made of their life together. He vacillated between moments of despair and fleeting hope that maybe this was a misunderstanding, a rash desire she would come to regret. He wanted to believe that love could conquer all, that their years together would outweigh a single mistake. But deep down, he knew that Jane's desire to pursue an affair wasn't just a one-time misstep. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that might be beyond repair. David's world had shifted, and he couldn't unsee what had been revealed to him. He began asking himself questions that felt alien in the context of his marriage. Was love enough to rebuild what had been broken? Was trust a thing that could ever be regained after betrayal like this? And most importantly, if Jane went through with it, if she truly followed through on her plans, could he ever look at her the same way again? He found himself staring at her more, watching her movements, wondering how much of the woman he had married was still left. He began to notice the small signs of detachment, the extra hours she spent at work, the long, unreturned messages, the way her eyes seemed distant when they spoke. David knew that her affair was no longer a distant possibility, it was an inevitable consequence of her desires. Jane wasn't trying to save their marriage, she was trying to justify her need for something outside it. And that realization left David in a quiet agony he hadn't been prepared for. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself in a state of quiet torment. Jane's carefree attitude only deepened his uncertainty. As he stared at the woman he thought he knew, he began to wonder if there was any path left where they could find each other again. She had asked for his forgiveness, and yet, with each passing day, David began to feel the weight of the decision she had made, the decision that would, sooner or later, force them both to face the truth. And David, in his broken heart, knew one thing for sure: she had already chosen. David had tried to play the part of the understanding husband, giving Jane the space she asked for. But as days turned into weeks, the truth began to weigh more heavily on him. Jane's indifference to the situation only seemed to grow, while his doubts and insecurities swelled like an uncontrollable tide. He had always trusted her. That night, as David lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, an idea began to form in his mind. He knew he couldn't just sit back and let Jane continue down this path without knowing the full extent of her betrayal. He needed proof, concrete evidence that would leave no room for excuses, no chance for Jane to deny what she was doing, and he couldn't trust her words anymore. David wasn't the type to take drastic actions on a whim, but this situation had pushed him to the edge. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet determination. David began paying closer attention to Jane's behavior, her schedule, her movements, her phone. He had always respected her privacy, but now, with his trust shattered, he felt justified in looking for answers. He started to track her comings and goings more carefully. He would come home early from work to see if she was there or if she had already gone out with the man she was so eager to see. He remembered Jane even mentioning casually that she had found someone, a colleague from her office, someone she described as interesting and fun. He began listening more closely to her phone conversations, noting how her tone softened when she spoke to him. At times, she would glance nervously at him as if sensing that he was watching her more closely than usual, but she didn't question it. David's plan started taking shape. He knew he needed more than just simple observations, he needed something irrefutable. His gut told him that Jane was planning to meet this man soon, so he quietly arranged to have a few extra hours at work, knowing she would likely meet him during that time. As he watched her prepare for another meeting with her colleague, he set his plan into motion. He wasn't sure how Jane would react once she realized that he knew what she was up to. He would confront her with the undeniable truth, he would lay the evidence bare and force her to see the damage she had done. It was a gamble, but it was the only way he could regain some sense of control in a situation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. David was no longer the passive husband who was simply trying to salvage a relationship that seemed beyond repair. He had transformed. He would no longer be the one left in the dark, wondering what was happening while Jane continued to enjoy life in her own way. His revenge wouldn't be explosive or dramatic. Instead, it would be cold, calculated, and methodical. He had set the trap, and all he needed to do now was wait for Jane to walk right into it. David could feel the tension building with each passing day. He wasn't just waiting for Jane to make a mistake, he was carefully watching for the perfect moment to strike. The day of her meeting with the man she'd been so eager to see finally arrived. Jane had been preparing for it all week, planning her outfits, arranging for extra work hours, and texting him late into the night. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a regular day, but to David, it felt like a ticking clock. His heart raced as he watched her get ready, her excitement palpable, while his own stomach twisted with a combination of anger and sadness. David had already put his plan into action. The day before, he had discreetly arranged to have a small hidden camera installed in the living room, strategically placed to catch the conversations she'd have. He wasn't sure how Jane would react when she found out about the setup, but it didn't matter anymore. She had crossed the line far too many times for him to back down now. As Jane left the house that afternoon, David stood in the doorway, watching her drive off. He felt no guilt. This was the only way he could gather the evidence he needed. He couldn't rely on her word anymore. The silence in the house was deafening, but David's mind was sharp and focused, waiting for the moments that would come next. Hours later, as the evening sun began to set, Jane returned. David could hear the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, followed by her footsteps on the porch. As she entered the house, she didn't seem any different, no signs of panic or guilt. She smiled at him, a smile that now felt hollow and empty to David. She greeted him casually, asking about his day, unaware that he had already seen everything. He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he remained calm, cool, and collected. As Jane made her way to the living room to remove her shoes and settle in, David turned on the hidden camera footage. The moment she sat down, David heard the voice of the man she'd been seeing. It was unmistakable. The sound of laughter and flirtation echoed through the speakers, and David's heart sank. There they were, speaking so casually about their plans, about how much they had enjoyed their time together, about how they enjoyed being intimate with each other, with no concern for the betrayal it caused. Jane's voice was soft, filled with the kind of intimacy that only came from someone who had truly fallen for another person. She spoke of their next rendezvous, planning the details with excitement in her voice. She never once mentioned David, never once acknowledged the man she had promised to love and cherish. Her infidelity was no longer a rumor or a suspicion, it was a documented reality. The evidence was undeniable. David sat still, his mind reeling with the images and words. His hands clenched into fists as he listened to Jane's excitement about her affair. She had completely detached herself from the life they had built together. She was no longer the woman he had married, the one he had once trusted with everything. He felt a surge of anger rise up, but he quelled it. This wasn't the time for an outburst. This was the time for confrontation. He waited until the footage had finished, until he had heard enough to confirm the truth. Jane was not only lying to him, she was living a double life. As she turned off the lights and made her way upstairs, David knew it was time to face her. He couldn't wait any longer. David stood at the bottom of the stairs, his pulse pounding in his ears as he looked up at the darkened hallway. He could hear Jane moving about upstairs, seemingly unaware of the storm that was about to hit. As he slowly ascended the stairs, David's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He could feel the weight of the camera footage in his pocket, the proof that would change everything. Jane wouldn't be able to deny it. The evidence was irrefutable. He had everything he needed to expose her. And yet, a part of him hesitated. David paused for a moment, staring at the closed door, and then without a word, he pushed it open. Jane was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, seemingly lost in her own world. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway, and for a brief moment, he almost felt the urge to turn around and leave. But he knew he couldn't. He had waited too long, sacrificed too much, and allowed too many lies to build up. Now, the truth would be laid bare, no matter how painful it might be. "Jane," David said quietly, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." She looked up at him, her expression one of surprise. She put the brush down, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw the seriousness in his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, the casualness in her voice masking a hint of nervousness. David didn't answer her right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small device that had been recording her conversations. He held it in his hand, letting it dangle between them for a moment. Jane's eyes widened when she saw what he was holding, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Do you recognize this?" David asked, his voice cold, almost detached. Jane's face flushed as she quickly stood up, clearly on the defensive now. "David, what is this? What are you talking about?" David didn't waste any more time. He pressed play on the device, and the room was soon filled with the unmistakable sound of Jane's voice, speaking to the man she had been seeing behind David's back. The words were clear, the tone unmistakable. Jane's laughter, her words of affection, her plans for their next meeting, it was all there, captured in real time. David watched as Jane's face turned pale, her lips trembling slightly as the realization hit her. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the recording playing in the background. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she simply stood there, frozen in place. "Is this how you saw our marriage ending, Jane?" David asked, his voice a mixture of pain and disbelief. "After I told you not to go on with an affair." Jane finally found her voice, but it was weak, filled with the guilt that she could no longer hide. "David, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't think you'd find out in any way. I thought we could just go our separate ways and you wouldn't even have to know." David's heart clenched in his chest at her words, but there was no time for sympathy, no time for forgiveness. He had been patient for too long, and now, all he could feel was the sting of betrayal. "Didn't you think it would hurt me? Jane, you've torn apart everything we built. You've lied to me, betrayed my trust, and now you think it's okay to hurt me." Tears welled up in Jane's eyes as she took a step toward him, but David didn't move. He didn't want her touch. Not now. Not after everything. "I never wanted to hurt you, David. I thought I could have both this affair and you. I was wrong, I know that now. But I never meant for this to happen." David shook his head, the weight of her words sinking in deeper. "You wanted another man, Jane, but now you're left with nothing but regret." He paused, taking a long look at her, his gaze hardening. I'm done, Jane. This marriage is done. The words felt like a final verdict, and as they hung in the air, both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Jane stood there, speechless, tears streaming down her face, but David couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now, it was his turn to make his. She had never seen David like this before, and it terrified her. The loving, forgiving man she had grown used to was gone, replaced by someone who had finally reached his breaking point. David's words echoed in her mind, leaving no room for doubt. Since you've chosen him, go live with him. This house isn't yours anymore. Jane's face was streaked with tears as she pleaded, her voice cracking. David, please, don't do this. I don't have anywhere else to go. Her heart raced, and she could hardly breathe as she saw the hard, unyielding look in David's eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't waver. You made your choice, Jane, he replied, his tone firm and unyielding. You wanted another man, now, go be with him. If he's good enough to break up our marriage, he should be good enough to give you a place to stay. David's words hit her like a slap. She'd expected anger, even an argument, but she hadn't expected him to go this far. It was as if all the love he once had for her had vanished, replaced by something unforgiving and impenetrable. David stepped back, his gaze cold as he watched her struggle with her suitcase. She looked at him one last time, but there was nothing in his eyes except the satisfaction of seeing her finally face the consequences of her actions. Left with no choice, Jane walked out, her heart sinking as the door shut behind her. In desperation, she dialed the number of the man she'd risked everything for, Mark, the one she thought would be her escape from her marriage. Her hands shook as the phone rang, and for a brief moment, she doubted whether he would even pick up. But when he answered, she clutched onto his voice as though it were her last lifeline. Mark. I need a place to stay, she began, her voice weak and uncertain. David found out about us, and he's kicked me out. Can I stay with you, at least until I figure things out? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and in that silence, a chill ran down Jane's spine. She had expected Mark to be understanding, to offer her comfort and a place to stay. After all, he was the one she'd risked everything for. But the silence was louder than any words he could have said. Jane, Mark's voice was calm but distant, as if he were speaking to someone he barely knew. I don't think that's a good idea. What we had was just, a fling. I never planned to take it further. I don't think it would be right for you to stay here. Jane's heart sank, and for a moment, she felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished. But, Mark, I left everything for you. I thought, her words trailed off as she realized the truth, he had never intended for this to be anything serious. She was nothing more than a fleeting moment for him, a distraction, something that could be brushed aside when things became too complicated. Jane, he continued, his tone growing more detached, I don't think we should see each other anymore. This isn't what I want. I didn't sign up for this kind of drama, and I definitely didn't want you to lose your marriage over it. I think it's best if we just move on. The words struck her like a hammer. Mark wasn't going to help her. He wasn't going to give her a place to stay, and he certainly wasn't going to be there for her now that she had nothing. In that moment, Jane realized just how much she had lost. She had been so captivated by the thrill of the affair, so convinced that she could have it all, that she hadn't stopped to consider what she might lose if it all fell apart. When the call ended, Jane stood alone in the street, the reality of her situation settling heavily on her shoulders. The life she'd taken for granted had slipped through her fingers, and now, she was left with nothing but regret and a suitcase filled with memories of a life she could never go back to. In that cold, empty moment, Jane had no choice but to face the truth: she was utterly alone. The man she had betrayed was gone, and the man she had trusted to replace him was never really there. As she walked away from the house she had once called home, she realized she would have to make a choice: either face the consequences of her actions and start over on her own, or continue running from the wreckage she'd created. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her, and she knew that whatever path she chose, she would never escape the shadow of her betrayal. David's resolve hardened as he stepped into his lawyer's office. The quiet, pristine space seemed fitting for the decision he was about to make. He had wrestled with his emotions over the past few weeks, fluctuating between heartbreak and anger. But now, the course was clear, and he was ready to sever the ties that had once bound him to Mia. Seated across from his attorney, Mr. Greer, David felt an odd sense of calm settle over him. He had already gone over the details in his head: how he wanted the assets divided, the terms of the divorce, and, most importantly, the instructions for Mia to come to the office and collect the papers herself in 1 week's time. He wanted her to experience the gravity of her decisions, to understand that there was no going back. "David, I know this isn't easy," Mr. Greer said, studying him carefully. "But it sounds like you're very clear about how you want to proceed. I'll prepare the documents as you outlined. She'll need to come here to sign them if you want to keep this as straightforward as possible." David nodded, feeling the weight of each word. "Yes, that's exactly what I want. I'm done with her. She's had enough of my time and patience. Let her come here and see what her decisions have led to. I want her to understand this isn't just paperwork, it's a consequence of what she's done." Mr. Greer leaned forward, his eyes reflecting a touch of sympathy. "Are you certain you don't want to wait longer? Some people choose a cooling off period." But David didn't hesitate. "No, Mr. Greer. This is what I want. I gave her a chance, and she made her choice." He took a deep breath, grateful that his voice didn't waver. "Just let me know when it's ready for her to pick up. 1 week from today." As he signed the preliminary documents, David couldn't help but think of the life they had built together, and all the moments now rendered meaningless. But that life was over, and there was no point holding onto it. This was his closure, his opportunity to start fresh, unencumbered by deceit and betrayal. With the legal matters set in motion, David left the office and drove to the bank. The next step was essential to protect himself financially. They had a joint account, one they had both contributed to over the years, and David knew he needed to ensure he wouldn't be left in a vulnerable position. He entered the bank with his mind made up, already envisioning a future where he didn't have to worry about sharing anything with her. At the counter, David requested to transfer the majority of the funds from the joint account to his personal account, leaving only a small amount behind for Mia. He knew she would need something to get by temporarily, but he wasn't about to hand over the savings they had built together, not after what she had done. The banker looked over the accounts and the amounts, confirming the transfer details. "Mr. Lawson, I'll make the transfer as you requested. Would you like confirmation of the transaction sent to you by email?" David nodded. "Yes, please. Send it to my email and ensure that no further transactions can be made on the joint account without my authorization." He knew Mia might try to drain the account if she had the chance, and he wasn't willing to take that risk. Not after everything he'd been through. As he left the bank, David felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. This was the final step, the last link to the life he had once cherished. He had thought their savings would go toward a future they'd build together, perhaps a new home or a family trip. Now, it was a foundation he'd rebuild alone, without her. Driving back home, David felt a surge of clarity. He had done everything he could to salvage their marriage, only to be met with betrayal and deceit. Mia's actions had left him no choice, and now, he was taking control of his life. The divorce would be the end of the chapter they had shared, but it would also mark the beginning of something new, something stronger. As he arrived home, David sat alone in the quiet, reflecting on what lay ahead. He had sacrificed enough of himself for Mia's selfish choices, and now he was determined to put himself first. He knew he would need time to heal, to rebuild trust and faith in himself. But he was ready to face that journey alone, knowing he'd finally reclaimed his peace of mind. The week ahead was bound to be challenging. When Mia came to collect the divorce papers, he knew she would likely try to plead her case, maybe even ask for forgiveness. But David was resolute. There was no more forgiveness to give. The next chapter of his life would be his own, free from the shadows of betrayal and disappointment. In 1 week, he would finally be free. And he was ready to close this painful chapter once and for all.
If you found this story gripping, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more intense and eye-opening stories just like this one. And remember, your support means everything. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.